Why did the metal detector scream only when she stepped forward? The sound cut through the visitor hall like a blade, sharp and sudden, freezing every casual conversation mid-sentence. Children clutched their parents' sleeves. Old men with navy caps tilted their heads, cameras lowered. Everyone turned toward the woman standing alone beneath the fluorescent lights. She didn't flinch. Her name was Haley Thompson, or at least that was the name printed on the civilian ID tucked inside her vest. She stood with her shoulders square, chin level, feet planted evenly on the floor as if the ground itself expected discipline from her. Not rigid, just ready. "Step aside, ma'am." The voice came with authority practiced enough to enjoy itself. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been waiting all morning for something like this, a reason to matter, a moment to enforce rules loudly and visibly. He gestured toward the secondary screening area like a judge passing sentence. Haley nodded once. Not quickly, not apologetically. Just once. The motion was so precise it almost felt rehearsed. She placed her handbag on the conveyor belt, fingers steady, breathing slow. Somewhere inside her chest, something tightened, not fear, not anger, but the familiar ache of being unseen, of being reduced to what people assumed she was. A tourist, a widow, a woman past her usefulness. The detector wailed again. Rodriguez's mouth curved into a thin smile. "Ma'am, I need you to keep your arms out. Don't move unless I say so." "Understood," Haley replied. The word slipped out before she could soften it. Military clean, automatic too clean. Chief Petty Officer Williams looked up from the duty desk. He didn't know why at first, just felt it. That instinct old sailors never lose, something in her posture, something in the way she didn't look around for reassurance or explanation. She stood the way officers stood when they trusted the process, even when the process was humiliating. The handheld scanner chirped as it passed over her wrist. "What's this?" Rodriguez asked. "A watch." It was black, scratched, cheap. But beneath it the skin told another story, a pale band where something heavier had rested for years, something official, something removed but never replaced. Rodriguez noticed, his smile faded. Shoes, bag, table. Each command came sharper than the last, each compliance quieter. People were watching now, phones half raised, whispers spreading. Haley felt it, the weight of judgment pressing down, familiar as gravity. She had stood in war rooms filled with men who doubted her. She had buried pilots who never questioned her orders until it was too late. She had learned long ago that dignity did not argue. It waited. Her bag was emptied piece by piece. Wallet, keys, phone, glasses, and then last she placed the device on the table. The room changed. Metal casing, old LEDs, antenna folded tight like a held breath. Rodriguez's voice hardened. "What is that?" Haley looked at it for a moment before answering. Memory flickered behind her eyes late nights, red warning lights, frequencies humming like heartbeats. A younger version of herself, sleepless, brilliant, stubborn. "Signal monitor," she said, "personal." That word did damage. Rodriguez leaned closer. "Civilians don't carry equipment like this into secure facilities." "I know." The honesty unsettled him, more than denial would have. Minutes passed, radios crackled, a supervisor arrived, questions stacked on questions, explanations given, but never the full one. Haley could feel the old tension rising now, the sense that something else was wrong, not here, not with them. With the air. The lights flickered. Once, twice. Then came the hum, not loud, just wrong. Haley's gaze lifted instinctively, scanning shadows, exits, power panels. The device on the table pulsed faintly. Her fingers twitched, stopping themselves. Rodriguez didn't notice. But she did. The pattern was too familiar. Too deliberate. She felt it settle in her bones. the cold certainty she had hoped never to feel again. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a warning. And Pearl Harbor, once again, was about to remember what silence before impact felt like. Sometimes the past doesn't return to haunt you. Sometimes it returns because it needs you. Why did every instinct she had start screaming before anyone else heard the alarms? The hum beneath the floor wasn't loud enough for panic. Not yet. It lived in the bones of the building, in the way the air felt slightly heavier like pressure before a storm. Haley stood still beside the stainless steel table, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes lowered just enough to look harmless. Inside her chest, calculation had already begun. Power fluctuations don't announce themselves, she thought. They whisper first. Rodriguez was still talking. Something about authorization, something about policy. His words blended into noise the way briefing room chatter used to fade when something real demanded attention. Haley's gaze drifted, not openly, never obviously, but she counted anyway. Exit points, fire doors, manual locks, the age of the lighting system, the placement of cameras. Too many blind spots for a place this important. She swallowed. The device on the table vibrated once, barely perceptible. If she hadn't tuned herself to it over decades, she might have missed it. A frequency spike. Not random, structured, testing the perimeter. Someone was knocking. "Ma'am." Rodriguez's voice snapped her back. He was irritated now. The kind of irritation born from not being in control of a situation he thought he owned. "You said this equipment was personal. That doesn't explain why it's active." Haley met his eyes for the first time. Not challenging, not apologetic. Measured. "It's always active," she said. "That's how it works." The room shifted again. Chief Williams felt it too this time. The cadence of her voice, the lack of defensiveness. Civilians argued when accused. They filled silence with justification. This woman answered like someone used to scrutiny and unafraid of it. "Sir," the young sailor at the scanner muttered, tapping his screen. "The X-ray system just reset itself." "That's normal," Rodriguez said automatically. But his eyes flicked to the overhead lights as they dimmed for half a second. Haley closed her eyes. There it was. A cascade failure beginning at the edges. Peripheral systems first. The kind of thing you missed if you trusted automation too much. The kind of thing she had warned about years ago and been told was improbable. She exhaled slowly. The past always comes back smarter. A radio crackled behind the desk, static where there shouldn't be. Williams frowned, adjusting the volume. "That's odd," he murmured. "Base ops usually." The transmission cut out. Silence rushed in to fill the space. Then the emergency lights snapped on, bathing the room in a low red glow that made every face look sharper, older, more afraid. The tourists murmured. Someone laughed nervously. A child began to cry. Rodriguez straightened. "All right, everyone remain calm. This is probably just a power fluctuation." Haley stepped forward. Just one step. "Petty officer," she said quietly, addressing Johnson as he entered with urgency in his stride. "This isn't a fluctuation." Johnson stopped. He didn't know why he listened. Maybe it was the certainty in her tone. Maybe it was the way she didn't raise her voice to compete with chaos. She didn't need to. "What do you mean, ma'am?" he asked. "The jamming began 12 minutes ago," Haley said. "Low-level, directional, they're mapping response times." Rodriguez spun toward her. "That's classified analysis. You don't." "You've already lost internal comms," she continued, eyes never leaving Johnson. "Backup systems are about to cycle. When they do, some won't come back online." Johnson felt a chill crawl up his spine. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've seen it fail before," she almost said. "Because I designed the safeguards meant to stop it." Instead, she said, "because your emergency lighting lagged by 3 seconds. That tells me your transition protocols are outdated. The air raid siren began to wail. Not electronic, mechanical, old, heavy. Every conversation died. Johnson's training surged forward, but there was a gap now, a hole where certainty used to be. His radio was dead, his tablet useless, his procedures depended on systems that were no longer answering. He looked at Haley again. Really looked. She wasn't panicking, wasn't posturing. Her hands were steady, her eyes alert but calm, as if this moment, this exact moment, was one she'd prepared for in a life she no longer spoke about. "What do you recommend?" he asked before thinking. Rodriguez's head snapped toward him. "Sir." "Shelter protocols," Haley said immediately. "Manual, route civilians through the museum wing. Avoid automated doors." "How do you know?" "I helped test them," she said and stopped herself. "Not yet." Johnson hesitated only a second longer. Then he nodded. "Rodriguez, lock down this checkpoint. Martinez, secure equipment. Williams, assist evacuation." The order moved. People obeyed. Even Rodriguez, though confusion flickered across his face like a crack in glass. As the civilians were guided forward, Haley took position naturally at the front, not because she was told to, but because space seemed to open for her. She raised her voice just enough to carry. "Stay together," she said. "No running, you're safe if you follow instructions." They believed her. That realization hit her harder than the alarms. She had spent years learning how to sound like certainty so others didn't have to be afraid. She had hoped, after retirement, she could stop wearing that voice. Apparently not. They moved through dim corridors. Emergency lights buzzed. Somewhere distant, something heavy thudded. Helicopters, she realized. Not Navy cadence. Different rhythm. Her jaw tightened. Johnson walked beside her now. "You still haven't told me who you are." Haley kept walking. "Right now, that doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said. "I'm responsible for these people." She slowed, finally turning to him. Close enough now that he could see the lines on her face. Not age exactly, but memory. Weight carried too long. "So am I," she said softly. They reached the shelter area without incident. Reinforced walls, manual systems, old tech. The kind that survived because it didn't need permission to function. Haley went straight to the comms cabinet. Johnson hesitated. "That's restricted." "I know." Her hands moved anyway, confident, familiar. She tuned a frequency that shouldn't still exist, but it did. Static, then voice. Johnson stared. "Base operations," Haley said into the handset. "This is Shelter Alpha 9, civilians secured, request status." The reply crackled back, demanding identification. She paused. This was the moment. The one she'd been avoiding since she stepped into the visitor center carrying a past she thought she'd buried. She glanced at Johnson. At Rodriguez, standing stunned behind him. At Chief Williams, whose eyes had gone wide with recognition he couldn't yet name. And she felt it, the old ache, the conflict she'd never resolved, the cost of being invisible versus the cost of being known. She lifted the handset again. "This is Admiral Thompson," she said quietly, "and Pearl Harbor is under coordinated attack." Silence followed. Heavy, reverent, disbelieving. Then the voice returned, changed. "Yes, ma'am." Haley closed her eyes for half a second. Not in relief. In acceptance. Because some burdens don't end when the uniform comes off. They wait. And when the moment comes, they ask, without mercy, whether you're still willing to carry them. Sometimes strength isn't revealed by force. Sometimes it's revealed by stepping forward when the world finally realizes it needs you. How did a room full of trained personnel suddenly forget how to breathe? The silence after her words pressed in from every side. Even the emergency lights seemed to hesitate, their red glow pulsing as if unsure whether to keep shining. Haley, Admiral Thompson now, though the name still felt like a coat she hadn't worn in years, stood with the handset resting lightly in her palm. On the other end, someone cleared their throat. "Say again," the voice said, slower this time. "Careful. Did you say Admiral Thompson?" "I did," she replied. "And you have a breach unfolding faster than your systems can tell you." Johnson felt his pulse in his ears. Admiral. The word rearranged everything he thought he knew about the last 20 minutes. The woman he'd almost dismissed as an anxious civilian had just stepped into a role that reshaped the entire chain of command without raising her voice. Rodriguez swallowed. He remembered his tone earlier, the smirk, the assumption. A heat crept up his neck that had nothing to do with the emergency lighting. "Yes, ma'am," the voice finally said. "This is Captain Morrison, Base Operations. We weren't informed you were on site." "You weren't meant to be," Haley said. "That doesn't change what's happening." She shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself. The shelter hummed with tension, tourists huddled together, eyes wide, whispering prayers or questions that had no answers yet. She felt them all, the way she always had. Command was never about standing above people. It was about carrying the weight so they didn't have to. "Report," she said. A pause, then the truth began to spill through the static. "Communications are compromised across multiple sectors. Automated defense systems are offline. We've detected unidentified aircraft approaching from the west, no transponders. Ground security teams report interference with access controls." Haley closed her eyes briefly, mapping it all in her head. Patterns layered over patterns. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. "Listen carefully," she said. "This is a phased operation. Electronic suppression first, confusion second, physical insertion third. They want you reacting, not thinking." Johnson leaned closer despite himself. "What do we do?" Captain Morrison asked. Haley opened her eyes. "We slow them down," she said. "Then we take back control." Her gaze moved around the shelter, taking inventory the way she always had. Personnel, civilians, equipment, morale, fear was present, but not panic, not yet. "Activate manual override 77 Alpha," she continued. "If it's still intact." The line went dead for 3 seconds. Then came disbelief. "Ma'am, that protocol was retired." "No," Haley said, "it was buried." She could hear the typing now, the frantic flipping through digital manuals that wouldn't help. She imagined younger officers discovering systems they'd never been trained on, safeguards hidden behind layers of assumption. "I wrote 77 Alpha," she added gently. "It will restore partial control to your perimeter defenses, but only if you stop waiting for confirmation." Another pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am." The channel stayed open. Johnson exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You planned for this," he said quietly. Haley didn't look at him. "I planned for the day someone would try." Her hands moved again, adjusting the shelter's internal systems. She rerouted power manually, bypassing automated nodes that were likely compromised. Old school, reliable, the kind of thing no one trusted anymore because it required thinking. Rodriguez watched, stunned. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, unsure how to phrase the question. She paused. "Long enough to know complacency," she said, "and long enough to know how dangerous it is." Outside, the sound of rotors grew louder. "Too close." Chief Williams stepped to her side, his face pale but focused. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "USS Missouri, 1995. Haley looked at him then. Really looked. And smiled, small, tired, genuine. "Communications Division," she said. "You kept us alive more than once." Williams felt something tighten behind his eyes. He straightened without thinking. "Yes, ma'am." The past had caught up with both of them. A new transmission cut in. Urgent. Breathless. "Admiral, this is Commander Davis. We've got confirmation. Hostile forces have landed near the museum complex." A murmur rippled through the shelter. Haley's jaw set. "How many?" "Unknown, at least 3 teams. They're moving with purpose." "Of course they are," she murmured. She turned to Johnson. "We're going to need to buy time." He nodded. "Tell me how." She studied him for a moment, not his rank, not his uniform, his willingness, his steadiness under pressure. Leadership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about listening when you didn't. "You're going to feel exposed," she said. "Manual defenses always do, but they're harder to predict. That's our advantage." She keyed the radio again. "Base operations, reroute all available personnel away from automated choke points. Use visual confirmation only. No digital tracking." "Yes, ma'am." The shelter lights flickered, then steadied. Something was coming back online. A cheer almost rose, but Haley raised a hand. "Not yet," she said quietly. "This isn't over." She walked toward the civilians now, her presence calm but unmistakable. She crouched slightly to meet a child's eye, her voice softening in a way it hadn't on the radio. "You're doing great," she said. "Stay with your family. We're taking care of this." The child nodded, trusting her without knowing why. Haley stood again, the weight settling back onto her shoulders. She felt it now, the old mix of pride and sorrow. Pride in seeing systems she'd designed still fighting, sorrow in knowing they were needed again. Another update crackled through. "Admiral," Commander Davis said, awe creeping into his voice. 77 Alpha is working. We've regained partial perimeter control." Haley allowed herself a single breath of relief. "Good," she said. "Now we prepare for what comes next." Johnson frowned. "There's more." "There's always more," she replied. "The question is whether we're ready." Outside, the helicopters shifted position. Inside, Pearl Harbor began to remember itself, not as a museum of the past, but as a living thing, defended by people willing to stand when systems failed. Haley Thompson stood at the center of it all, no longer hidden, no longer underestimated. Not because she demanded recognition, but because, when everything else went dark, she remembered how to light the way. Sometimes leadership isn't about stepping into the spotlight. Sometimes it's about standing steady when the lights go out. Why did the silence between updates feel heavier than the alarms ever had? Haley stood still, listening, not to the radios, not to the footsteps echoing through reinforced corridors, but to the gaps, the pauses where information should have been, the spaces where certainty used to live. Those spaces were where things went wrong. "Admiral," Commander Davis said over the open channel, "we've stabilized the western perimeter, but we're seeing movement underground. Maintenance tunnels. Old ones." Of course, she thought. Pearl Harbor had been built in layers, history stacked on history, decisions buried beneath newer decisions. The tunnels had been mothballed decades ago, left off digital maps because they were considered irrelevant. Forgotten infrastructure was always the most dangerous. "Seal what you can," Haley said. "Don't chase. Let them move where we want them." Johnson turned to her, concern etched into his face. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't know how many they are." Haley met his eyes. She could see the tension there, the weight of responsibility pressing down, the fear of making the wrong call. "We don't need to," she said. "We need to know how they think." She gestured to the schematic pulled up on a portable board, hand-drawn now, sketched quickly from memory and partial data. Routes highlighted, dead ends circled. "They're disciplined," she continued. "They've studied this place, but they're also expecting us to rely on automation. That's the mistake." Rodriguez hovered nearby, silent now. The swagger was gone, replaced by something rawer. Regret, maybe, or humility. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I want to apologize for earlier. Haley raised a hand, stopping him gently. "Save it," she said, not unkindly. "You did your job with the information you had. Just make sure you do it better now." He nodded, relieved and chastened. The shelter shook slightly, distant, controlled detonations. Not explosions meant to destroy. Tests, probes, someone knocking again, harder this time. The civilians tensed, whispers rose, fear thickened the air. Haley felt it pull at her. She remembered another shelter years ago, another group of frightened faces. Different continent, same fear. She had promised them safety too. Some promises were heavier than others. She turned back to the radio. "Davis, redirect Team Echo to Tunnel Junction, see quiet approach. No lights." "Yes, ma'am." "And pull back aerial assets," she added. "They're being used to draw our attention." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "They want us looking up," Haley said. "They're already inside." The line crackled then. "Understood." Johnson watched her closely now. "You sound like you've seen this exact play before." Haley's jaw tightened. "I've seen the consequences," she said. "That's enough." A memory surfaced, uninvited, desert heat, a faulty assumption, a delay that cost lives. She pushed it down. Now wasn't the time. The shelter doors opened briefly as a small team entered, mud on their boots, tension in their shoulders. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we encountered resistance near the archival wing. They withdrew before engagement." Haley nodded. "They weren't there to fight you." "Then why?" "To see how fast you respond," she said. "And who?" She turned back to the map. "They're narrowing their window." The realization settled heavily. This wasn't just an attack on infrastructure. It was a test of leadership, of response, of whether Pearl Harbor had learned anything from its past or merely polished it. Chief Williams approached her quietly. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "if they reach the command archives." Haley finished the thought for him. "They won't." "How can you be sure?" She looked at him, and for a moment the years peeled away. He saw the officer she'd been then, sharp-eyed, relentless, unwilling to accept inevitability. "Because I know what's in there," she said, "and I know what it means to them." She keyed the radio again. "Base operations, initiate protocol mirror." There was hesitation this time. "Ma'am, mirror requires executive confirmation." "You have it," Haley said, "and you have 30 seconds." Johnson felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not physically but structurally. Mirror was legendary, a contingency so extreme it was whispered about, never taught, designed to protect not just assets but narratives. "What does protocol mirror do?" he asked. Haley didn't look away from the map. "It locks down the truth," she said, "so it can't be stolen." The seconds ticked by, the hum deepened. Somewhere, heavy doors began to move. Then confirmation. Protocol mirror engaged. The building seemed to exhale. Outside the shelter, movement changed. The hostile teams hesitated, routes closed, signals scrambled. "They're confused," Davis reported. "They're falling back." Haley allowed herself a single nod. But relief was dangerous, she knew that. "Don't pursue," she warned. "Let them retreat, watch where they go." A new voice cut in, tight, urgent. "Admiral, this is Security Lead Harris. We've detained an individual near the tunnel exit. He's claiming asylum." Haley stiffened. "Asylum?" "He says he wants to talk to you, by name." The shelter seemed to shrink. Johnson looked at her. "Ma'am." Haley's mind raced. Someone inside the operation, someone who knew her. That narrowed the field uncomfortably. "I'll handle it," she said. She followed Harris down the corridor, each step heavy with anticipation. The air grew cooler, the lights dimmer. The man sat on the floor, hands bound loosely, face bruised. He looked up as she approached and smiled faintly. "Hello, Admiral," he said. "You're older than I expected." Haley stopped a few feet away. "And you're alive longer than you deserve," she replied. Recognition flashed in his eyes, still sharp. "What do you want?" she asked. "To finish what you started," he said. "Or stop it, depends how you see it." She studied him, not the threat, the regret, the fractured lines of someone who'd made choices and lived with them. "You picked the wrong day," she said. He laughed softly. "You always say that, even when it's already too late." The words hit harder than she expected. "Talk," she said, "now." He leaned back against the wall. "This attack wasn't about Pearl Harbor," he said. "It was about you." The corridor seemed to tilt. "They wanted to see if you'd still come," he continued. "If you were still the woman who would step forward when no one asked her to." Haley felt the weight settle again, the burden she'd never truly put down. "And now?" she asked. "Now they know," he said, "and so do you." She turned away before he could see what that knowledge cost her. As she walked back toward the shelter, radios buzzing with reports of retreat and recovery, Haley felt the familiar mix of victory and loss. The base was stabilizing. The civilians were safe. But something else had been exposed. Not her rank. Her resolve. Some people waited their whole lives to be seen. Others spent theirs trying to disappear, until the world reminded them why it wouldn't let them. Sometimes redemption doesn't come as forgiveness. Sometimes it comes as responsibility, returning one last time. Why did victory feel heavier than defeat ever had? Haley stood alone for a moment outside the holding room, one hand resting against the cold concrete wall. The base around her was breathing again, systems humming back to life, radios speaking in full sentences, boots moving with purpose instead of panic. From the outside, it looked like control had been restored. Inside her, something was unraveling. The man's words echoed louder now that the immediate danger had passed. This wasn't about Pearl Harbor. It was about you. She had spent years convincing herself she was done being a variable, done being the axis everything turned on. Retirement was supposed to be quiet, anonymous, a life where she could sit in the back of rooms and let history move without her fingerprints on it. Apparently, history disagreed. "Ma'am." Johnson's voice pulled her back. He stood a respectful distance away, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes searching her face, not for answers, but for permission to ask the questions he was holding back. "They're asking for you at operations," he said. "Full briefing, they want you present." Haley almost smiled at the phrasing. "Want you present." As if she'd ever really left. "I'll be there," she said. They walked together through corridors that now buzzed with controlled urgency. Personnel snapped to attention as she passed, some formally, some awkwardly, some with dawning realization written plainly across their faces. The salutes came instinctively, but Haley noticed the hesitation behind them. Respect mixed with disbelief, with curiosity, with something like relief. Inside operations, the air was thick with focus. Screens displayed stabilized perimeters, retreat vectors, intercepted signals. Officers spoke in clipped tones, each word weighed and measured. When Haley entered, the room didn't stop, but it adjusted, like a compass needle settling. Captain Morrison stood immediately. "Admiral." "At ease," Haley said automatically, then caught herself. She wasn't here to command the room, not officially. Or so she thought. Morrison gestured to the main display. "We've confirmed full withdrawal of hostile forces. No casualties. Minor infrastructure damage, thanks to your intervention." Haley studied the data without speaking. The operation had been precise, surgical, and unfinished. "They learned what they came for," she said quietly. Morrison hesitated, which was. "Confirmation," she replied, "that the old contingencies still work, and that I still respond." A murmur rippled through the room. Johnson shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, with respect, if this was about drawing you out." "Then it worked," Haley finished. She turned, meeting their eyes one by one. This won't be the last attempt, not here, not elsewhere. The room fell silent. They're mapping people now, she continued. Not just systems, who steps forward, who hesitates, who still remembers how things used to be done. Morrison swallowed. What do you recommend? Haley felt the weight of the question settle onto her shoulders like an old, familiar coat. Heavy, unavoidable. I recommend you stop pretending the past is irrelevant, she said, and start integrating it with intention. She moved closer to the display, pointing out subtle patterns others had missed. Timing discrepancies, behavioral tells, strategic patience where aggression would have been expected. They weren't testing our firepower, she said. They were testing our restraint. The officers leaned in now, listening the way people listen when they know they're learning something that can't be taught in a manual. And we passed, Johnson asked. Haley paused. For today, she said. The briefing wound down, orders disseminated, systems checked and rechecked. Gradually, the room emptied until only Haley and Morrison remained. He cleared his throat. Admiral, I need to ask you something. She looked at him, tired but attentive. Why come here today? He asked. Of all places, of all days. Haley considered lying. It would have been easy, convenient. Instead, she told the truth. Because I was invited, she said. Morrison blinked. Invited. A symposium, she explained. On legacy defense systems, irony wasn't lost on me. She let out a quiet breath. I almost didn't come. But you did. Yes. Because some part of her had known, the part that never fully powered down, the part that listened for hums beneath the floor. She excused herself and stepped outside into air that smelled faintly of salt and fuel and history. The harbor lay calm now, deceptively peaceful. Tourists were being escorted back out, shaken but unharmed. Life resuming its rhythm. Johnson approached again, slower this time. They're asking what happens next. Haley watched the water. What do you think should happen next? She asked. He hesitated. I think we can't afford to lose people like you. She smiled faintly. You already did once. The words weren't bitter, just true. I chose to leave, she continued, and that choice mattered to me. Johnson nodded, but so does today. Yes, she said, it does. A commotion near the security wing drew her attention. The detained man was being transferred, flanked by guards. He caught sight of her as he passed and met her gaze without fear. You showed up, he called softly, just like they said you would. Haley didn't respond. She didn't need to. The guards moved him along, his presence already fatting into reports and interrogations and classified files. But the damage, or the clarity, he'd delivered lingered. That evening, long after the base had returned to something resembling normalcy, Haley stood alone at the memorial. Names etched into stone, some familiar, some not. She traced a finger over one she remembered too well. I failed you once, she thought. I won't again. Footsteps approached behind her. Chief Williams stopped a respectful distance away. Ma'am, he said, they're preparing a formal statement about today, about you. Haley closed her eyes. I don't want a ceremony, she said, or headlines. Williams nodded. I figured. They'll want to make this about rank, she continued, about authority, about spectacle. And it was. She turned to him. No, it was about responsibility. Williams considered that, then smiled. You haven't changed. Haley looked back at the harbor, the fading light casting long shadows across the water. Yes, she said softly, I have. Because she knew now what she'd been avoiding. This wasn't about being needed. It was about choosing to be present, again, knowing the cost. Some people retire from service. Others realize too late that service never really retires from them. And as night settled over Pearl Harbor, Haley Thompson understood that redemption wasn't a moment. It was a decision, one she might have to keep making, again and again, as long as the world kept testing whether she still cared enough to answer. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't stepping back into the fight. It's accepting that the fight still recognizes you. Why did the dawn feel less like an ending and more like a summons? The sky over Pearl Harbor softened from black to blue in slow, careful layers, as if the night itself was reluctant to leave. Haley stood on the edge of the pier, hands resting on the railing, watching light touch the water without making a sound. After everything that had happened, the quiet felt earned and fragile. She had learned to distrust quiet. Behind her, the base was still awake, not frantic anymore, purposeful, the kind of motion that followed survival. Reports were being written. Calls were being made to places that would never admit how close they'd come to losing control. Decisions were already forming that would outlive today. She breathed in, steady and slow. For the first time since she'd spoken her name aloud again, the weight on her chest shifted, not lighter exactly, but better balanced. Like a pack adjusted after a long march, still heavy, just no longer cutting into the same place. Footsteps approached, measured and familiar. Johnson stopped beside her, careful not to intrude on the silence. He didn't speak right away. He'd learned over the course of one impossible night that Haley valued space more than reassurance. "They're standing down the last of the emergency protocols," he said finally. Full control restored. Haley nodded. "Good." A pause stretched between them, filled only by the sound of water against steel. "There's something else," Johnson added. "Washington's on the line, multiple lines actually." She smiled faintly. "Of course they are. They want to talk about reinstatement," he said. "Consultative authority, advisory roles, task forces with names that sound important." Haley closed her eyes. She had known this was coming. The system always tried to reclaim what it found useful. It wrapped its need in language like honor and duty, as if those words could soften the cost. "And what do you think?" she asked. Johnson hesitated. "I think they're afraid of what happens if you say no." Haley opened her eyes and looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise in earnest now. Gold spread across the water, touching the memorial, the ships, the quiet geometry of the harbor. The same harbor she'd sworn once to protect, then learned, painfully, that protection didn't always look like presence. "They should be," she said softly. "Fear keeps people honest." Johnson let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "You're not going to make this easy for them, are you?" "No," she said, "I never did." They stood together a while longer. No ranks, no titles, just two people watching a place remember itself. Eventually Johnson spoke again. "The man we detained, he's talking." Haley didn't turn. He always would. "He says the operation was a signal," Johnson continued. "A test, like you said, but also a message." "Messages are just questions wearing confidence," Haley replied. "What's the question?" "Whether the people who built the safeguards still believe in them." Haley's jaw tightened, not in anger but recognition. "They're betting on erosion," she said. "On fatigue, on the idea that time dulls conviction." "And does it?" Johnson asked. She considered the question carefully, not as an admiral, not as a strategist, but as a woman who had lived long enough to know what time took and what it left behind. "Time doesn't dull conviction," she said at last. "It reveals whether it was ever real." Johnson nodded slowly. A chime sounded from her pocket, an old phone, not a secure device, a personal one. She checked the screen and felt something in her chest loosen. A message, simple, from a name she hadn't seen in years. "I heard you were back. I knew you would be." Haley exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. Some connections didn't require maintenance. They survived because they were built on truth, not proximity. She typed a reply and slipped the phone away. "Will you take the call?" Johnson asked gently. Haley looked at him then, really looked, not as a subordinate, not even as an officer, but as someone who would inherit what came next. "I'll take a conversation," she said, "on my terms." He smiled. "That's more than they deserve." She turned from the water and began walking back toward the base. With each step, she felt the old tension ease, not because the burden was gone, but because it was finally aligned with choice. They reached the operations building, where officers waited with careful expressions and rehearsed language. Haley paused at the door. "Johnson," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Yesterday," she said, "you asked what happens next." He nodded. "This," she said, gesturing to the building, to the people inside, to the machinery of responsibility grinding back into motion. But not the way it was before. She stepped inside. The calls came in waves, some cautious, some eager, some wrapped in flattery thin enough to see through. Haley listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was with precision, with boundaries, with clarity earned the hard way. She declined ceremonies, deferred titles, accepted one thing only, the authority to ask difficult questions without needing permission. By mid-morning, the base had returned to routine. Tourists filtered back through checkpoints. Children laughed again, unaware of how close fear had come to changing the day. The harbor reflected the sky as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Haley found herself back at the visitor center, the place where it had begun. The metal detectors were quiet now, the lights steady. Rodriguez stood near the entrance, posture straighter than before. When he saw her, he hesitated, then spoke. "Ma'am," he said, "I won't forget yesterday." Haley met his eyes. "Good," she said, "neither will this place." He nodded, understanding something that hadn't been taught in training. As she prepared to leave, she paused once more at the threshold, not to look back but to acknowledge what had been set in motion. She didn't know how many days like this remained in her life. She didn't need to. Service had taught her that counting wasn't the point. Choosing was. Outside, the sun was fully risen now, the world carrying on with its beautiful indifference. Haley adjusted her jacket and walked forward, unrecognized by most, unchanged by rank, steady in the knowledge that dignity didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly. It acted when needed. And it stayed, long after applause faded, in the choices made when no one was watching. Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't power reclaimed or authority restored. Sometimes it's the courage to answer, once more, when the world calls your name not for who you were, but for who you still are.